It was supposed to be a peaceful Saturday morning in the quiet suburb of Maplewood, Perth. The sun bathed the front yard in golden light as Michael sipped his coffee, watching his two kids, Jake and Lily, laugh while riding their bikes. But that peace was short-lived. For weeks, Michael had noticed near accidents, scraped knees, wobbly turns, and cars speeding past too close for comfort. His driveway, the only safe space for his kids to ride, had become a danger zone. That morning, he made a decision. He would close off the driveway to protect them. He wasted no time. Within an hour, he had secured a sturdy lock on the gate, ensuring no unexpected traffic could put his kids at risk. A wave of relief washed over him. Finally, he could relax, knowing they were safe. But just as he settled back into his chair, a shrill, piercing voice shattered the moment. "Michael, what the hell do you think you're doing?" He turned to see Meredith Jenkins, his next-door neighbor, storming toward him, her face red with fury. Known for her relentless interference in everyone's business, Meredith was a self-proclaimed enforcer of the Maplewood Homeowners Association rules. "You can't just block off the driveway. It's against community regulations," she snapped. Michael straightened, sensing the storm brewing. He had anticipated pushback, but he hadn't expected war. Michael took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm as he met Meredith Jenkins' fiery glare. He knew this woman, always poking her nose into things that didn't concern her, always finding a reason to stir up drama. And now, she was standing in his yard, hands on her hips, acting like she owned the entire suburb of Maplewood. "You can't just block off the driveway," Meredith snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "It's against HOA regulations, and you know it." Michael crossed his arms. "Actually, I checked the guidelines. There's nothing that says I can't secure my own driveway for my kids' safety." But Meredith wasn't having it. Her lips curled into a smirk as she pulled out her phone. "We'll see about that," she said, her fingers tapping furiously. Within minutes, sirens echoed down the street. Michael blinked. Had she seriously called the cops? Over a locked gate? A police cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, exchanging glances as they approached. One of them, Officer Daniels, looked more annoyed than concerned. "Sir, we got a call about an HOA violation," he said, glancing between Michael and Meredith. Meredith was already in full performance mode, her voice dramatic. "He's blocking the driveway. It's against the rules. He thinks he can just do whatever he wants." Michael sighed, rubbing his temples. "Officer, my driveway is on my property. I put the lock there to keep my kids safe from reckless drivers. I'm not violating any laws." Daniels exchanged a look with his partner before turning back to Meredith. "Ma'am, this is a civil matter. There's no criminal offense here." Meredith's face darkened. "So you're just going to let him get away with this?" she spat. The officers ignored her tantrum and turned to Michael. "Sir, unless the HOA has filed a formal complaint with legal backing, this isn't a police matter. Just try to resolve it with them." And with that, they left. Michael turned to Meredith, expecting her to back down. But instead, she clenched her jaw, seething. "This isn't over," she hissed before storming off toward her house. Michael exhaled, shaking his head. He should have known it wouldn't end here. That evening, as he sat down for dinner, a loud thud outside made him jump. He rushed to the door and froze. An envelope lay on the ground. The HOA logo was stamped on the front. He tore it open and his stomach twisted. A fine for closing his own driveway. Anger simmered beneath his skin. This wasn't just about a locked gate anymore. This was war. What do you think? Is Michael being treated unfairly, or should he just comply? Drop a comment below with "fight" if you think he should stand his ground, or "give in" if you think it's not worth the trouble. And don't forget to subscribe for part 3, because trust me, it's about to get even crazier. Michael sat at his kitchen table, gripping the HOA letter in his hands. A fine for securing his own driveway. His jaw tightened as he read the justification. Unauthorized obstruction of community access. What a joke. His driveway wasn't a public road. It was his property. But he knew exactly who was behind this. Meredith. His frustration deepened as he replayed the day's events in his mind. The way she had called the police like he was some kind of criminal. The way she had stormed off, already plotting her next move. He had hoped the fine would be the end of it, but he was wrong. The next morning, as he stepped outside to grab the newspaper, his stomach twisted. His mailbox had been ripped open, letters and bills scattered across the pavement. Some were torn, others soaking in the morning dew. But it was the message scrawled across his front door in red marker that made his blood run cold. Remove the lock or pay the price. Michael's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was personal. He quickly snapped photos, documenting the vandalism. His first instinct was to confront Meredith, but he stopped himself. She was smart, too smart to get caught in something like this. If she was behind it, she would never leave direct evidence. Instead, he decided to reach out to his neighbors. If Meredith had targeted him this aggressively, surely he wasn't the first. He started with Mrs. Rodriguez next door, a widow in her late 60s who had lived in Maplewood for over 20 years. When she opened the door, her expression softened at the sight of him. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, shaking her head. "Meredith's been running this neighborhood like her own little kingdom. You're just the latest person in her way." Michael stepped inside, listening as she shared stories of harassment, arbitrary fines, and sudden rule changes, all orchestrated by Meredith. It was the same pattern. Anyone who opposed her found themselves drowning in HOA violations, sudden, anonymous complaints, and even police visits over fabricated issues. "She's got the HOA wrapped around her finger," Mrs. Rodriguez sighed. "They're too afraid to challenge her, and most of us, well, we've just learned to stay quiet." Michael's gut twisted. That explained why no one had warned him. They were all scared. But he wasn't. He spent the next few hours speaking to other neighbors, uncovering more of the same. Meredith had built her power over years of intimidation and manipulation. She played the long game, using HOA fines and bureaucracy to punish anyone who didn't fall in line. But this time, she had picked the wrong fight. As Michael returned home, determination settled in his chest. If Meredith thought she could bully him into submission, she was in for a rude awakening, because he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Michael wasn't one to let things slide. If Meredith thought she could intimidate him into backing down, she had underestimated him. With every fine, every vandalized mailbox, and every whispered story from his neighbors, his determination only grew stronger. He knew he had to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone Meredith had steamrolled over the years. His first step was to gather solid evidence. He spent hours combing through HOA regulations, city zoning laws, and property rights. He needed to prove beyond any doubt that he had done nothing wrong by locking his driveway, and he found it. According to the Maplewood HOA's own bylaws, a homeowner could restrict access to their driveway if it was solely on private property. There were no specific regulations against installing a lock for safety reasons. That was his legal foothold. But that wasn't enough. Meredith had spent years tightening her grip on the HOA, using her influence to manipulate votes and decisions in her favor. If he wanted to win, he needed to expose how deep her control ran. Michael started keeping records. Every letter he received, every interaction he had with the HOA, and every conversation with his neighbors was meticulously documented. He snapped pictures of his vandalized mailbox and the threatening message scrawled across his door. Then, he turned to the HOA meeting minutes. With help from Mrs. Rodriguez and a few other neighbors, he got his hands on years' worth of records. As he flipped through them, a pattern emerged. Meredith had orchestrated nearly every major HOA decision for over a decade. From sudden increases in neighborhood fees to unexplained fines against those who spoke out against her, she had been playing puppeteer all along. The final piece of the puzzle came when a local journalist, Sarah Donnelly, caught wind of the conflict. She had covered HOA corruption before and was eager to dig into what was happening in Maplewood. Michael shared everything he had found, and Sarah promised to look into it further. But before he could put his plan into action, Meredith struck again. One evening, as he arrived home, he found his driveway padlocked shut. Someone, Meredith, had taken it upon themselves to ensure he couldn't even use his own property. Michael clenched his fists. Enough was enough. It was time to confront Meredith where she held the most power. The next HOA meeting. The night of the HOA meeting, Michael walked into the community center with his head high. The tension in the air was thick, and the room was packed. Neighbors who had once stayed silent were now watching closely, waiting to see what would happen. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, and right in the middle, with her usual smug expression, was Meredith. She wasted no time. "This meeting is called to address Mr. Callahan's continued violations," she announced, her voice dripping with condescension. His driveway closure has disrupted the harmony of our community. Michael stood, unshaken. It was time to turn the tables. I have evidence that proves I did nothing wrong, he said, his voice steady but firm. He pulled out the HOA's own bylaws and handed copies to the board members. According to your own regulations, my driveway is on private property. I have the legal right to secure it. Murmurs spread through the room as some board members exchanged uneasy glances. Meredith, however, wasn't ready to back down. These documents are outdated, she snapped. Besides, this isn't just about the rules, it's about keeping our community safe and orderly. Michael's lips curled into a slight smirk. Safe and orderly? That's interesting coming from someone who's been selectively enforcing rules for years. The murmurs grew louder, and then he dropped the bombshell. I've been going through HOA meeting records, and I've found a disturbing pattern. HOA fines and rule changes that just so happen to target specific homeowners, many of whom, coincidentally, had disagreements with you, Meredith. He turned to the board. How many of you were pressured into decisions? How many of you signed off on fines without questioning why? The room went silent. A few board members looked uncomfortable. Michael knew he had struck a nerve. Meredith's face twisted into anger. That's ridiculous. You have no proof of that. But she was wrong. Michael turned toward the back of the room, where Sarah Donnelly, the journalist, had been quietly taking notes. She stood up, holding a stack of printed emails and documents. I do, she said. I've been investigating HOA corruption, and these documents show a clear pattern of abuse of power. This HOA has been used to settle personal grudges, and homeowners have been unfairly targeted for years. Gasps erupted in the room. Some neighbors looked furious, others looked ashamed. The board members shifted in their seats, realizing they were now under scrutiny. Meredith's confidence cracked for the first time. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She was cornered. The HOA president cleared his throat. We will need to review this evidence before making any decisions. But Michael could already see the tide turning. The community wasn't blindly following Meredith anymore. As the meeting adjourned, Meredith stormed out without another word. But Michael knew she wasn't done. She had ruled over Maplewood for too long to go down without a fight, and he was ready for whatever came next. Michael left the HOA meeting knowing one thing. Meredith was losing control. For the first time, people weren't just nodding along with her demands. They were questioning, whispering, doubting. He could see the cracks forming in the empire she had spent years building. But he also knew Meredith wouldn't go down quietly. The next morning, Michael awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing. A new message flashed on the screen. This isn't over. Back off while you can. There was no name, but he didn't need one. The intimidation tactics were classic Meredith. Instead of feeling fear, Michael felt something else. Resolve. Over the next few days, things in the neighborhood grew tense. Some neighbors, emboldened by what they had learned at the meeting, started speaking out. Others, still under Meredith's influence, whispered warnings to Michael to stop pushing. Then, the real bombshell hit. Sarah Donnelly, the journalist, published her investigative report on Meredith and the HOA. The article laid everything out in brutal detail: years of selective rule enforcement, arbitrary fines, and shady backroom deals. The documents Michael had helped provide were now public, and the response was explosive. By midday, the HOA's email inbox was flooded with complaints. Homeowners who had stayed silent for years were coming forward with their own horror stories. Then came the official inquiry. A legal team representing a group of homeowners filed a formal complaint against the HOA board, demanding an independent audit of their practices. The city council took notice. Maplewood wasn't just another HOA-controlled suburb anymore. Now it was under scrutiny. That night, Michael spotted Meredith standing on her porch, gripping her phone, her face pale with fury. The neighborhood she once controlled with an iron grip was slipping away from her, and she knew it. But even with her back against the wall, Michael knew one thing for certain. Meredith wasn't done fighting. Michael barely had time to process the fallout when the last desperate move came. 2 days after the article went live, a HOA emergency meeting was announced. The agenda? Vote of no confidence. Michael knew what that meant. Meredith wasn't just scrambling to save herself. She was trying to turn the tables. When he arrived at the community center that evening, the tension was thick enough to cut. The room was packed, more residents than he had ever seen at one of these meetings. Some looked furious, some nervous, and some, like Meredith, still clung to power. She stood at the front of the room, her usual smugness barely intact. "This community has been thrown into chaos by lies and exaggerations," she began, her voice cool but forced. "We have let outsiders influence our way of life. And now, I call for a vote of no confidence in the HOA board members who have failed to protect this neighborhood from misinformation." The nerve of her. Michael shot a glance at the board members. Half of them looked ready to cave, the other half too afraid to speak. It was now or never. Michael stood up. "The real problem isn't misinformation," he said, his voice steady. "The problem is the abuse of power." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. For years, fines have been issued without due process. Rules have been enforced selectively. And let's not forget, intimidation and harassment against homeowners who dared to question authority. Gasps, more whispers. Meredith's expression cracked. "That's absurd." Michael held up a stack of papers. "Is it? Because I have documentation proving otherwise. And now, so does the press, the city council, and soon, a legal investigator." The room erupted. Neighbors stood up, demanding answers. People who had once been too scared to speak finally found their voices. And then, in the middle of the chaos, the moment happened. A motion was put forward, not just against the HOA board, but against Meredith herself. The very people she had bullied and manipulated for years voted to remove her from any position of authority. The count wasn't even close. As the results were read out, Meredith stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief. For the first time, she had lost. Michael watched as she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The reign of terror was over, and Maplewood was finally free. The night Meredith was officially removed from power, the entire neighborhood of Maplewood felt different, lighter, freer. It was as if the very air had shifted, no longer weighed down by the paranoia and control she had wielded for years. Michael walked home that evening with a sense of triumph, but he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, as he stepped outside to grab his newspaper, a familiar sight greeted him. Meredith, standing on her porch across the street. But this time, there was no arrogance in her posture, no smug expression, just silence. For a fleeting moment, Michael almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then he remembered the threats, the vandalism, the harassment. Not just toward him, but toward anyone who had ever dared to challenge her. No, Meredith had earned this downfall. Yet, even in defeat, she wasn't done scheming. By the afternoon, rumors started circulating. Meredith was planning something. Some said she was trying to appeal the HOA's decision. Others whispered she was pulling strings behind the scenes to form a new committee and regain control. Michael wasn't surprised. A woman like Meredith didn't just fade into the background. So he did what any smart person would do. He stayed prepared. Alongside the neighbors who had stood up against her, he helped organize a community watch. They made sure every change in policy was recorded, every new rule was fair, and most importantly, that no one like Meredith would ever take control again. And then, something amazing happened. With her influence gone, the neighborhood started to heal. People who had once been divided by fear came together. Homeowners who had been afraid to speak out finally voiced their concerns. The HOA, under new leadership, implemented real changes, fair policies, transparent meetings, and most importantly, the end of ridiculous fines and selective enforcement. One evening, as Michael unlocked his driveway, finally free from all the drama, he noticed something unexpected. Meredith's house was up for sale. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the "for sale" sign planted firmly in her front yard. She was leaving. The Queen of Maplewood had finally fallen, and just like that, it was over. Or was it? Because if there's one thing Michael had learned through all of this, it's that power never truly disappears, it just finds a new host. And who knew what or who would try to take control next? What do you think? Is Meredith truly gone for good, or will she find a way to crawl back? Drop a comment below with "Bye Meredith" if you think she's out for good, or "She'll be back" if you think she has one last trick up her sleeve. And don't forget to subscribe, because in Maplewood, the drama is never really over.